Hello and welcome to The Point World Affairs. I'm Tae Sang-mi. The conflict between South Korea and Japan, which rekindled at the end of last year, has escalated into a quote-unquote severe state. South Korea's Supreme Court ruling, which demanded two of Japan's biggest companies to pay compensation to Koreans forced into labor during Japanese colonial rule, has spilled over into the military field. Japan claims a South Korean naval ship used a target lock radar on its patrol aircraft. What is the intention behind the Japanese government's allegations that only amplifies the controversy without putting forth clear evidence? For that, we have with us Mason Ricci, an associate professor of international politics at Hankuk University of Foreign Studies. Thank you for joining us today.
Great, thanks for having me. I'm happy to be here.
On December 20th, South Korea's destroyer Kwanggecho the Great was carrying out a humanitarian operation to assist a North Korean vessel drifting in the East Sea. It was during this process that Japan claims the South Korean warship directed its fire control radar toward a Japanese patrol aircraft. A lock with fire control radar is considered a hostile act and only one step away from the actual firing. About a week later after the incident, Japan released a video footage that it said proved a South Korean warship indeed locked its fire control radar onto a Japanese warplane off the northeastern coast. But the South Korean government is refuting the claims, saying that videos alone are not enough to prove Japan's allegations.
일반 상식적인 측면에서 추적 레이더를 조사했다는 일측 주장에 대한 객관적인 증거로 보기 어렵습니다.
Meanwhile, on January 1st, Prime Minister Shinzo Abe himself mentioned the incident during an interview. Despite repeated denials from Seoul's defense ministry, Abe claimed that South Korea has indeed locked its fire control radar onto the Japanese warplane. To this, South Korea's defense ministry also released a video clip directly refuting Japan's claims. Seoul claims that Tokyo's patrol aircraft was flying at a low altitude, which was highly threatening to the ship. On this week's The Point World Affairs, we discuss Prime Minister Abe's current political situation in Japan and what he ultimately wants to achieve as he tries to boost his approval ratings with the military tension with South Korea.
So we want to talk about this radar incident that happened between South Korea and Japan. So why do you think Prime Minister Abe, without having clear evidence, is talking about this issue? Especially he mentioned about making public a 13-minute long footage of this incident back last year. What do you think about that?
Yeah, the first thing I'll say is I think this incident is actually a pretty big deal as it marks a change in Japan-South Korea relations, which sometimes are rocky, but generally the rocky relationship is confined to diplomatic disagreements or international legal disagreements. Here we've moved into a situation where there was a sort of worrisome encounter, a worrisome incident involving operational military activities. So I think that marks a change. My sense from looking at the videos is that the South Korean destroyer fire control radar operators should not have trained the fire control radar on the Japanese aircraft, on this the P-1 aircraft. There's no rules of engagement for when you would do that, especially since Japan and Korea are in principle friendly countries. By the same token, the P-1, in my estimation, at least looking at the videos as best as we can tell, should not have approached the South Korean vessel in the way that it did. But the video evidence is unclear, and actually in some ways that's precisely what Abe wants. This unclear video actually allows him to make this incident in some ways bigger than it is, and it also allows him to instrumentalize it. And so the question is, why is he doing that? Why not simply deal with this issue in a more low-key way through mutual consultations between the South Korean and Japanese militaries? And the answer to that, I think, is at least two, and there's some domestic political reasons and some international political reasons. Domestically, he's facing a big year with upcoming elections, some sagging popularity, and he's clearly trying to rally his conservative base. On the international scene, he's been pushed a little bit into the shadows over the last months, especially with the inter-Korean peace process, the U.S.-North Korea denuclearization negotiations, and at least most recently, the U.S.-China trade dispute. So I think this is one way for Conte to sort of make an argument that Japan is still relevant.
Right, so going back to the latest incident between the two countries, on January 1st, Prime Minister Abe said that this radar incident was a dangerous act from South Korea on these allegations. But then at the same time, on the same day, the head of Japan's Maritime Self-Defense Force confirmed that he will convert this helicopter destroyer, JS Izumo, into a completely different aircraft carrier for the F-35B. So do you think these two issues are intertwined?
They are in a certain way. I mean, to begin with, Abe is correct that this was, in fact, a dangerous incident. Fire control lock-on is the last thing that a target perceives before it's targeted and potentially fired upon. Again, looking at the video, it seems to me like the Japanese pilots weren't actually concerned that they were going to be fired upon. Their reaction didn't seem to indicate any panic or concern. And it looked, again, to me, when I looked at the videos, that, in fact, the South Korean destroyer's guns were pointed away from the Japanese aircraft. I do think that Abe is instrumentalizing this issue. He's trying to use it as a way, I think, to soften up the Japanese population for changes to the constitution, as well as for a military buildup, including the transformation of the Izumo into a form of an aircraft carrier that will be able to carry F-35Bs.
Okay, we'll get back to that constitutional amendment parts later. To hear more about the issue, joining me now is Jonathan Miller, a senior visiting fellow at Japan Institute of International Affairs. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you. It's great. I'm happy to be on.
With the confirmation that the JS Izumo will be retrofitted into a full-on aircraft carrier to accommodate the F-35s, Japan is going to need to spend an astronomical amount in its defense spending. Do you think the Japanese public will be supportive of the plan?
Yeah, well, I mean, this is something that when the Izumo, the first Japanese helicopter carrier, was established, I don't think this was something that was a big surprise that Japan would take this extra step, that would be able to accommodate fixed-wing aircraft. There is a cost to it, but I think that there's also a sense from the Japanese public, whether it be the situation on the Korean Peninsula, specifically with North Korea, the provocations from North Korea, while the U.S. seems to be a bit more hopeful about the past year. I think Japan is still deeply skeptical about where the situation is going to go, and I think you see that quite clearly in the defense guidelines that were released at the end of this year. There's still an urgency in Japan. So there has been no vaccine. There's been no quick solution to this issue. So that's one element of it. But the bigger long-term strategic challenge is not on the Korean Peninsula for Japan, but it's China. So I think that when you look at the aircraft carrier, but other technologies that Japan is focused on in its most recent guidelines, you have to think about its long-term strategic approach to China.
Why do you think Japan is trying to increase its weapons development in the country when the international community is trying to make peace on the Northeast Asian region, especially when it comes to denuclearization on the Korean Peninsula?
Well, I think there's a lot of uncertainty. I mean, I think that there is the element of what's happening now in the U.S.-Japan relationship. I think in the long term, I think there is an element of how Japan's kind of looking and assessing the commitment of the U.S. in the region. But really, I think this goes back, fundamentally to the point that I made in the last question on China. I think that Japanese strategic policymakers and in the defense side just think that there's no way that they can match or mitigate tensions currently happening with China without a significant retrofit of its military and security capabilities. And this is not just something from a defense perspective of bigger ships or more aircraft, but this is a whole security retrofit. So the way I like to describe it is this is a national security retrofit. We saw, and this is gradual, it's more of an evolution rather than a revolution. So we saw in 2013 when Abe was first reelected, They've established a National Security Council. They put their first ever national security strategy. So this is about how the strategic culture within Japan on thinking on national security and defense issues needs to adapt and needs to change. So I think that's something that the Abe 2.0 administration is really focused on.
Prime Minister Abe has always blatantly expressed his intention to retool the Constitution. Do you think Abe will be able to revise the Article 9, and do you think he has the support of the Japanese public?
Yeah, this is a challenging one for Abe, I think, on a number of fronts. I mean, most people know of the hurdles. Obviously, he needs the 2/3 of both houses support and then the public referendum of 50+1. He does currently have those 2/3 in both houses, but the important caveat there is that is a coalition with the Komeito party, which is generally not supportive of especially constitutional revision that may impact Article 9. So that's an important one to note. And then even if he does get to that point, he would need to win a public referendum, and there's still even polling on that shows that it's a very dicey call. But even putting all that on top of it, Abe basically, his final term only could conceivably last to 2021, and he's got a lot on the calendar. He has an upper house election coming up this coming summer. The emperor is abdicating, so there's going to be a new imperial era starting in April, the end of April. We have a consumption tax happening, rise happening in October. So there's a lot of things happening that there's just not a whole lot of political space for Abe to take that risk. So I think it was instructive to see in his New Year's speech that he didn't really mention this in any great detail. And I think that this is something that he's going to try to get through at least that upper house election, I think, before he tries to go back to that.
Thank you for the timeline of events. That was Jonathan Miller from Japan Institute of International Affairs based in Tokyo. Now, do you think that Prime Minister Abe will be able to actually revise this constitution that he has been pushing for since returning back to office in 2012?
It's going to be a really tough sell. And the two things that are, I think, really toughest about it in terms of rewriting the Article 9 elements of the Constitution are getting it through both houses, considering that he is going to have to convince some recalcitrant parties, namely their coalition party, Komeito, to go along with this. And then also you're going to have the upper house elections, which, if they swing unfavorably for the LDP, may leave him with a very thin margin for getting that 2/3, or perhaps even not having that margin at all in the upper house. And then beyond that, of course, you've got the referendum, which I think he might have an easier time selling in some respects, although the Japanese public is closely divided on the issue. If I were a betting man, I would say that it probably wouldn't happen, simply because I think that there are a lot of very difficult things that have to be accomplished in order for that to make it happen. And it's interesting, in the New Year's commentary that he didn't bring that up, considering that many people consider that to be a sort of legacy issue for him. So I think in some ways he might be revising a little bit how much emphasis he wants to put on that. One other thing I'll say about the retrofit of the Izumo is it's not only about China, although clearly that's, I think, what's driving it strategically, but there is also an alliance, a U.S.-Japan alliance maintenance issue at stake here. The U.S., especially under Trump, is putting greater pressure on allies to show that they're willing to spend resources in order to make their own security and defense commitments match those of the U.S. Trump in particular is extremely transactional, and so for him, I think it's important to see Japan purchase those F-35Bs from the U.S. In terms of balancing out, some of the trade issues that the U.S. and Japan are having, plus the capability that comes along with that.
There have been a series of incidents that strained South Korea-Japan relations way before the radar row further added to the hostility. At the end of October last year, the South Korean Supreme Court ruled Japanese firms to compensate roughly $89,000 to each of the forced Korean laborers during Japan's colonial rule. However, this sparked a diplomatic uproar. The Japanese government maintains its stance that the issue of forced labor was completely resolved in 1965 when the two countries normalized diplomatic relations.
韓国政府の対応をまずは見極めたいと思います。国際裁判も含め、あらゆる選択肢を視野に入れて、自然とした対応を講ずる考えでありますけれども。
Also, on November 21st, the South Korean government disbanded the Reconciliation and Healing Foundation it set up with Japan in 2015 as a means to resolve the comfort women issue. This sensitive topic had long been a target of national criticism within South Korea as a closed-door agreement with Japan. Many in Japan say that the radar row erupted due to the historical issues between the two countries, but others say that Prime Minister Abe is further aggravating the conflict in order to push his approval ratings up. Abe's government recently passed an immigration law that aims to attract 345,000 foreign workers over the next 5 years, seeking to plug gaps in the country's rapidly shrinking and aging workforce. We connect with experts in Japan to analyze Prime Minister Abe's current political situation in that country and what he ultimately wants to achieve from this ongoing conflict with South Korea.
So we continue our discussions with another expert in Japan. Joining me now is Sachio Nakado, Professor of International Relations at Ritsumeikan University. Hello, welcome.
Okay, hello. Good to see you again.
It's been said that the so-called raider feud between South Korea and Japan stemmed from the Abe administration's complaints regarding the latest series of historical disputes between the two countries, such as the comfort women issue or the wartime forced labor of South Koreans. What do you think?
Well, actually, I agree with your assessment. If Japan and South Korea maintains amicable relations, probably I would even assume that the radar issue could have been resolved through negotiations by defense authorities of the respective countries. Unfortunately, Japan and South Korea have been in a severe state since the end of 2017, when the review of the Comfort Women Agreement is announced. So maybe one could argue that current situation could be regarded as a continuation of a series of history problems.
Abe's approval rating had dropped quite a bit over time, and some speculate that Abe is trying to raise this approval rating in his administration. So what is the current situation within Japan right now?
Well, actually, it is true that approval ratings of the Abe administration have dropped. But there are several issues to discuss. First of all, there are some political scandals among cabinet members. And number two, the Abe administration passed a new immigration law, which faced severe criticism from the opposition party as well as experts. So in that sense, it is safe to say that current Abe administration, the political situation is not really favorable for himself and his cabinet. And as you mentioned already, public opinion will actually become increasingly important for Prime Minister Abe in the coming up election scheduled in July.
The relationship between Seoul and Tokyo is not in the best situation right now, but how do you foresee the relationship will unfold in 2019, and what kind of events can we predict to improve bilateral relations?
I assume that the current tension will continue for some time. The history issues cannot be solved like in a minute, and also perception gaps over the denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula between Japan and South Korea might also contribute to the mistrust between the two countries. But worst case scenario is actually if Japan takes countermeasure against the freeze of asset of Japanese corporation, or Japan officially appeals to the International Court of Justice, the current situation could be worsened. Are there any opportunity to improve relations between the two countries? One possibility is G20 in Osaka, scheduled in July. If Prime Minister Abe and President Moon have a summit meeting and express their commitment to improve their relations, that might help. And I personally hope to see President Moon give a talk to the Japanese public directly. That might also improve the image of South Korea in Japan as well.
Thank you. That was Professor Sachio Nakado from Ritsumeikan University in Kyoto. Now, Professor, the traditional disputes, especially the territorial and historical disputes between the two countries, are the main concerns that is really keeping them away from true reconciliation. What do you think?
Yeah, I think that's absolutely true. Japan has in some sense never really fully admitted guilt for the things that happened historically in the lead up to and during World War II in the way that, for instance, Germany did. And so we see, for instance, Germany and France, just to give a sort of parallel historical example, who are closely united allies, in part because of the way that Germany handled post-World War II, most famously with Willy Brandt's Kniefall in the 1970s. And we still see Korea and Japan dealing with these historical issues. On the other side, I, as an external observer who perhaps, again, needs to be careful about what he says, think that Korea would be better off strategically by being more magnanimous and beginning to move on from some of these things and not tenaciously holding on to so many of these historical grievances, especially because we're at a very tense moment right now in Northeast Asia. It's a crucial moment where we can go in several different directions. We can go towards more peace and stable security architecture, or we can go more towards confrontation, whether that be because of North Korea or China. Or other factors as well. And Northeast Asia would benefit tremendously from greater South Korea-Japan cooperation. Unfortunately, I agree with Nakata-san that it's probably not going to happen. It's difficult to see how that improvement is going to take place. And unfortunately, China is the big winner of this spat.
Right, and looking at the domestic politics within Japan, there are some elections this year, prefectural and local. So some are saying that Prime Minister Abe is using these external security factors to leverage his power or take advantage of these local elections. What do you think?
Yeah, I clearly think that's the case. He has a lot on his plate this year. Nakata-san mentioned, of course, the emperor's abdication and the enthronement of the new emperor. You have the local elections, you have the Senate elections, or the upper house elections. And with all of those things going on, plus the constitutional reform, plus military modernization and transformation, plus all of the other things that are going on, whether that be the fallout of the immigration law or the upcoming consumption tax increase, whether that be international organization meetings, including the G20 to be held later this year. He really needs to make sure that he rallies his conservative base, and considering his dropping poll numbers throughout 2018, he needs to find any tool he can in order to do that. And unfortunately, it's a tried and true tactic of many leaders to find external problems and external threats as a way to distract from domestic difficulties.
Just as Professor Nakado mentioned, there are some events that in this year we can expect perhaps some friendly gestures, especially in June, the G20 summit, for instance. Do you think in 2019 we'll see some smiley faces on both leaders?
Again, if I were a betting man, I would say no. Or if we see smiley faces, it might be more like that tense smile that Abe had with Xi Jinping a few years ago. It may be a forced one through clenched teeth. There is the opportunity in Osaka during the G20, if Moon and Abe meet, there clearly could be something that takes place there. It will be interesting to see. It will be interesting to see whether Kang Kyung-hwa and Taro Kono manage perhaps to smooth over the problems and can lead towards a path in which something positive could come out of the G20. And then, of course, there's the Senate election. And once that happens in Japan, depending on how it comes out, Abe might feel like he's under less domestic pressure, in which case, he could start to perhaps send some olive branches towards Seoul. And if things are going well with Seoul, they might be willing to accept them. So it's not entirely a dire picture, although if I were a betting man, I would say that this year probably isn't going to lead to a tremendous breakthrough in improving Korea-Japan relations.
Okay, thank you very much for your balanced insights. Thank you.
Thanks for having me.
Japan may be very close to South Korea geographically, but the two countries have been at odds for decades with their historical conflicts. We'll be closely following how this new source of conflict and the history-related disputes will affect Seoul-Tokyo relations in 2019. That's all we have for this week's The Point World Affairs. Thank you for tuning in, and see you again next week.